Good morning, everyone. This is going to be episode 7 in our series on the debate challenge. I've offered people to debate me on, still not gotten a real acceptance yet from anybody on this issue on whether Paul's account in Acts 9, and now we're seeing another argument. It's also in Acts 23, verse 11. That's by Roberto providing that last episode or 2 episodes back. And that is that in the Son of Man prophecy of Matthew 24, verse 5, verses 23 and 27 as well. Jesus says that, the question he's answering is, what will be the sign of your return? He says, well, once I'm gone, descended, when I come back, it will be a universal event that every eye will see me. So if anyone says they met me in a wilderness place, that's a road out, it's a place outside of a city. In Hebrew, the word wilderness and also in Greek meant a place outside of cities. So outside Damascus counts in that regard. So Paul's statement that Jesus came down and visited him, other people were with him. They could hear Jesus' voice. They could see the light. And it's not a mental vision inside of Paul's head. It's literally it's physical presence of Jesus on earth that violates the Son of Man prophecy, doesn't it? So that's the question. That's the debate. Can anyone disprove that? And Jesus says, anybody who says they met me in a wilderness place, you must not listen to him. The other thing Jesus said, you can't listen to someone who said they saw me in a private room and they said he's here. He met me in my room, and that's not allowed either. And that's what's in this passage of Acts 23:11, as Roberto recently pointed out. So you had this remarkable coincidence. Coincidence, is it? That Paul violates both prongs of Jesus' examples of how this could be violated by private appearances in a private room and one on a road outside of a city, a wilderness. So let's take a look at this account. What happened here is Johnny wrote me a comment on one of my a comment on one of these videos, and he gave a suggestion of what he thought could be the answer, the solution here. Well, actually, he said it's unsolvable, I guess is what he was trying to suggest. It's not provable. But we're going to see that's not how this is going to work out for him, because we have clear words of Paul that can be construed objectively. And what does it mean to say, Jesus stood by me, and then he tells me 16 words? What is that? Tell me, what does that sound like to anybody? But Johnny doesn't see it, and he gives his reason. So we're going to look at that. So we'll take the time to look at that for about 10 minutes. And hopefully this will expand the issues that we have resolved and put away, that nobody would even bring these up. But if they want to, they know the arguments. They can try to defeat this. Okay, so here's Johnny's comment from just one day ago. But first, I want to read you Acts 23:11 so we can know the context of this comment back. Acts 23:11, we're going to look at Mountie's reverse interlinear so you can see the Greek underlying words. The following night, the Lord stood by him. Following what? Is the guards had saved Paul from the riotous mob. They brought him to this citadel or barracks the troops would maybe use, and put him in a room there to protect him from this mob. So the following night, the Lord stood by him, by Paul, and the Lord obviously is Jesus, and said, "Take courage, for as you have testified to the facts about me in Jerusalem, so must you also testify in Rome." Those are 16 words when you count them in Greek. So let's read what I say to him. Johnny Genlock writes, "Go Cowboys! What about them Rangers? 1,000 years hence, nobody's going to know what either of those Texas colloquialisms mean. Likewise, with phrases and expressions 2,000 years old, you are presuming you have the mindset of Paul and know the precise meaning. I am alleging you do not have the mindset of that time. Maybe Paul was Irish. I just used a colloquialism there because many Irish have the second sight. Paul is not here to question on the stand, counsel, whether he outright alleged a physical appearance of Jesus or whether it was merely a mystical vision. Ergo, you can presume by his wording you know exactly what Paul's meaning, but it is a presumption. When someone in our English culture says, 'stand by me,' like the song lyric, it means give support. Are you going so far as to presume Jesus could not have appeared to Paul and provided support in a time of trial? Now, this is what's weird. He just said he could not have appeared. I wonder if he made a mistake in his wording. What I mean, I think he's meant to say, are you going to so far as to presume Jesus could not have visited him in a vision and provided support in time of trial? But actually, he said it the opposite of what he meant, I think. Yeah, I totally believe he did appear. This Paul's Jesus did appear to Paul. That's what I'm saying. But anyway, he misspoke, I think. That then could get applied with a large brushstroke to discount any account of Jesus appearing to anyone, anywhere, anytime. And I guess maybe he did mean to say appear, because now he's saying if he can't appear to Paul, then are you saying he couldn't appear to anybody in any time? Yeah, he can't appear to anybody at any time, Johnny. So actually, I think he did mean to say that. So I think what he's saying is he didn't physically appear this time, but are you saying he can't appear anytime? So I think he's even objecting to the whole premise of that Matthew 24 means what it says, but he doesn't explain himself. So I'm not going to even pay much attention to that. I didn't even realize it until rereading this carefully here. Okay, so let's go on. Are you ready to go there? Yes, I'm ready to go. That yes, Jesus never appeared to a single person after his ascension. That's it. He cannot do that. He cannot appear on earth. That's what he said. If they say met me in a wilderness road or a private room, it's not me. Don't believe them because when I return to earth, every eye will see me. There's no dispute about that. So I don't know. Maybe he's throwing some shade that way. As I said, I think there are many better arguments to be made regarding Paul, and you have done incredibly excellent work making those. A few verses remembered, not complete. All right, so now let's take a look at the response I gave. Well, if it is presumption, the following commentaries agree with me that it is an appearance of Jesus beside Paul that Paul is claiming, a physical return of Jesus to Paul himself. This is in, and I've numbered them each so that if anybody, I'm going to put this in a description so anybody can look up these citations. Number 1 is Pett's, 2 MacClaren, 3 Barnes, Expositors, 5 Pulpit Commentary, 6 Smith's Bible, and 7 F.B. Meyer's. And there were others, but it's redundant, I think, so I didn't go through it all. Pett's commentary, number 1, URL above, is exemplary. Quote, in fact, there was apparently only one person who was satisfied with the way that things were going, and that night the risen Lord, meaning Jesus, stood by Paul, presumably visually, and encouraged him. Compare Acts 18, verses 9 to 10, and Acts 22, verses 17 to 21. He told him to be in good heart, for it was God's purpose that just as he had testified openly about him in Jerusalem, so he would testify in Rome. He was not to see what was happening as a setback, but as an opportunity. God was in control. So what he's saying is based on prior experiences with Jesus, his Jesus appeared to him visually, and he could see him, just like he saw him on the road to Damascus. So why do we have to skirt around this issue the way Johnny's trying to do? That's these commentators have no problem with it because that's what it says. He stood by him and then says these 16 words. It doesn't say I saw him in a vision, which would be a normal way of expressing it to indicate which kind of standing by me. Was it standing by me in my imagination, in a vision, whatever? No, he's letting you believe. Paul wants you to believe that he actually had Jesus standing right next to him, talking to him one-on-one. Okay, let me continue. Thus, Pett's commentary is saying that just as Jesus appeared in the locked room with the 12, Paul claimed a locked room experience with Jesus in Acts 23. Pause. Meaning, of course, there's guards all around Paul, so nobody can get in this room. So it had to be a locked room experience. So Jesus could pass through walls with the 12. He can do the same with Paul. So I say this. This was similarly post-ascension, meaning similar to the prior experience of Paul on Damascus, but also it was unlike the visit of Jesus to the 12 in that locked room set forth in John 20, verse 19 to 21:9, because that was pre-ascension. So the only difference between the 12 apostles seeing Jesus in a locked room was that was pre-ascension. He hadn't left yet. But Jesus in Matthew 24 rule that I'm not coming back in any private place or wilderness road or at all on earth, that happens and bars anybody who's claiming a post-ascension where Jesus has already gone to heaven. He cannot come back until a set time, and that time will be a universal return. So that's what's the problem for Paul. This is the second time he's claiming Jesus spoke to him personally on earth, physically, where he could see him visually, as Pett's commentary makes mention. And just so you know what John 20:19 to 29 says about this locked room experience, quote, the disciples were afraid of the Jewish leaders, and on the evening of that same Sunday, they locked themselves in a room. Suddenly, Jesus appeared in the middle of the group. He greeted them and showed them his hands and his side. End of quote. Why is that significant? Because again, I don't believe that Jesus could, without a consternation, have come into this room with Paul and him see him visually unless that room could be penetrated without breaking a lock. I don't think Jesus would be outside the door with a lock and key trying to get in. No, he did the same thing he did with the 12. And so it's totally feasible with Jesus. And that's a miraculous thing, but also has. All right, so now we have to ask a question, a digression, a very important digression is if this is someone claiming to be Jesus and he's already ascended, obviously that's true. This is Paul's experience with Jesus was 4 years after the ascension. That's in Acts 9, and the ascension is in Acts 1. So there's no dispute that it could not possibly be anything but the ascended Jesus has returned for a private visit with Paul in this account, in this second account, as in the first account in the Damascus Road experience itself. So if it isn't Jesus, who else can it be? And if I can't explain that to you, I can't show you that who it would be, then it's possible you could say, well, who other than Jesus could it be? So I'm going to have to prove, as part of this case, that this is somebody who could appear extra dimensionally through the walls of a room and is operating in that realm, another realm of dimensions than our visual dimensions that we can see. Okay. So this person can step out of that dimensional spirit, that dimensional place, and come into our area, just like Jesus did in that passage in John. So here's an article that somebody actually studied this, a good Christian guy. And his article is called Of Angels and Men of Different Dimension. And he's going to prove that the angels can operate in a different physical dimension than us and are actually operating in that dimension, but we can't see them unless they cross into our dimension. And that happens from time to time in the Bible. And this article is by Will Dressel, and I'll provide a link to it in the description. And he says in the subheading, we know from Scripture that angels and God can live in different dimensions than us. And here's an example. We know from now. I'm going to make a position here. Is Satan is a fallen angel, and I'll go through and prove that in a second. And he's an angel of light, and he's an angel of blinding light. So all these characteristics fit that first appearance in the book of Acts, chapter 9. And now what we have here is a being that can transfer through walls. There's no way that Paul is not being kept someplace where you've got to find him in a room. Okay. We know from Scripture that angels and God can live in a different dimension than us. For instance, in 2 Kings 6, the king of Syria was intent on making war with Israel, but every time he tried to set a trap, the king of Israel was a step ahead of him. This really frustrated the king of Syria. And one of the king's servants said that the prophet Elisha tells the king of Israel that words that you speak in your bedroom. So somehow Elisha is able to listen to words that are actually being spoken in a bedroom. And that also gives you this idea that God can appear extra dimensionally and be physically present in your room and hear you, and then transmit it to Elisha. Anyway, continuing. So the king of Syria finds out where Elisha is staying and sends his army to capture him. Elisha's servants wake up in the morning to discover the mountain, and this is the extra dimensional aspect, was full of horses and chariots. See that painting to the right? This is a painting of this event. So what nobody could see normally is they're right there. They're in your dimension, and now they're visible. Okay. In fear, he asked Elisha, what are we going to do? Elisha prayed and said, Lord, I pray, open his eyes that he may see. So now the person who couldn't see before can now see that dimensional area and see these angels moving in their midst. The Lord opened the servant's eyes, and he saw, quote, the mountains was full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha. When we begin to consider other dimensions that are parallel to ours, this all makes sense. Okay, now is Satan an angel with these powers? Okay, and he falls from heaven, but he doesn't lose these powers. Let's look at what the Billy Graham Association says in 2012, and this resonates anyway if you just know the Bible. But they do a good synopsis. The Bible doesn't give us a detailed account of Satan's origin, but it does indicate that Satan originally was one of God's angels, created by him to carry out his will. But apparently, Satan became filled with jealousy and pride, and he decided that he would lead a rebellion against God so he could take God's place as the ruler of all creation. The Bible says, quote, you said in your heart, I will make myself like the Most High. Isaiah 14, verses 13 to 14. But Satan's rebellion failed, and he was cast out of heaven. Now Satan and those who followed him are fallen angels, no longer part of God's heavenly army, but separated from heaven's glory forever. Satan, is still powerful, however, and he still does everything he can to block God's plan for our lives. Don't be deceived. Satan is your enemy, and he will do everything he can to keep you from God. Okay, so he has the same capacity as he had before to appear in a place where he physically shouldn't be able to appear. All right, so now let's look at the three appearance accounts and what the effect of that light was on Paul. Paul's three appearance accounts of Jesus outside Damascus, Acts 9, 22, and 26, never mention seeing anyone other than a person in a bright light who says, I am Jesus whom you persecute. I mean, he says other things, but that's the gist of who he sees, one person. Paul at the end finds he has been blinded as a result of the light. As Wikipedia notes, the journey is interrupted when Paul sees a blinding light. Conversion of Paul. Now, I want you to read verse Acts 22:11 there. And in fact, I'm going to pull it out and so you can see it, because this verse is crucial to understanding who this being really was if it wasn't Jesus. And when I could not see for the glory of that light, being led by the hand of them that were with me, I came into Damascus. So what is Paul saying? He says, due to the glory of that light that he saw emanating from this being who said he was Jesus, as a result of that light, and then being led by the hand of them that were with me, and being blinded by that light, I came into Damascus. So that also is Paul's indicating where this happened was outside Damascus. And in the language of that era, any place outside of a city is called the wilderness. So when Jesus says, you will not see me in a wilderness place, this is exactly admitted by Paul that he was not inside a city. He was outside of the city of Damascus. Then he comes into Damascus after, but in that condition, he's blind. And who causes blindness? That light emanating from this being. And we're going to ask, who is a blinding light being? Blinding light being, that's the key. Who has a light that blinds you. You'll be shocked. Okay, so I found an article that has nothing to do, doesn't mention the road to Damascus, is pro Paul in every way. He just tells you what is the history of the word Lucifer and where it comes from. What does it mean? It means he's an angel of blinding light. You'll say, oh, that's impossible. But let's listen to someone who has no idea he's unwittingly exposing something to us that we otherwise wouldn't know. So I begin. Let's see what the Bible commentary says about Satan as a blinding angel of light. And by the way, we'll see dictionaries say the same thing. How art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning? How art thou cut down to the ground, which that did weaken the nations? Isaiah 14:12. The Hebrew word Hellel, H-E-L-E-L, keep that in mind, which is translated Lucifer in Isaiah 14:12, entered English through Greek and German. In the Greek, we have Helios, the sun god. In German, this became Helen, from which came the word helder, which means clear or shiny. But there is also a sense of blinding, that is, blinded by the light. In this, and thus Hellel, in this. And thus Hellel entered English as hell, a covered place, a place of darkness as if blinded, a place far off from God. Now this is important. See this word Hellel? The EL at the end is the way you would say God. So then you would have hell and then the word God. When split apart, can read bright or clear God. So that word hell means brightness. See? So then you would have the name of this Satan, Lucifer, it means bright God. And that's how you get Lucifer, bright God. But you don't see the word God there the way they translated it. The early Christian church clearly understood that hell was a proper noun and that Lucifer matched him not only in the meaning of his name, but also in character. So this is an article, Lucifer and the angel of light, father of lies. I'll put a link to that. He continues, or another article, Satan, the true father of Cain. Hallel, a shining one, Strong's 1966. So Hallel, the word translated Lucifer means a shining one. Lucifer in Isaiah 14:12 is the Latin translation of Hallel, which means brightness. See, so that's an article called Satan, the true father of God, father of Cain. Then I go on. The original Hebrew word translated as Lucifer in Isaiah 14:12, Hallel, comes from a verbal root that means to shine brightly. See halal in Strong's 1984. So stop there. Who is Paul seeing? Someone who's a bright, shining light blinds him. And what is this? What is the message here about who this is in the word meanings? It means blinded and blinded by the light, and it's a bright or clear God. And the word hell comes from this. So this is not small potatoes information. This is important stuff for us to know. And then Jesus says something interesting. I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven. Jesus, Luke 10:18. Now, when this happens, Jesus has already been tempted in the desert by Satan. He's already, told us Satan is in charge of all countries, nations, worlds, all that. And Satan offers him the kingdoms of the world. So this is all happening before he even begins his ministry. So during his ministry, when he says Satan is fallen like lightning from heaven, that means that Satan maybe was trying to get into heaven and then he fell back to earth, but he wasn't in heaven. He doesn't have any access anymore once he becomes Satan. I mean, and once he becomes an adversary of God, God doesn't allow him walking around in there as far as we know. All right. But the point is this, what Jesus says is you see Satan appears as lightning, meaning a very bright, shining light. So Satan is a fallen angel long prior to Jesus' day and tempts Jesus in the desert. But Jesus sees Satan during his ministry, beginning of his ministry, fall like lightning from heaven at a later time. Can this be Jesus prophesying about Paul's Jesus in the future? Just a thought. Now listen to Paul himself tell you who he understands Satan is, and in 2 Corinthians 11, verse 14. And no wonder, for Satan himself masquerades as an angel of light. And that's why I had this heading up here. Paul closed his mind about who was this blinding light on the road to Damascus. He didn't put two and two together. It just never connected in his head. Oh my gosh, it isn't really Jesus. It's Satan himself, the angel of light. Now, this is a summary. Listen to this. I can't make this stuff up, ladies and gentlemen. Pictorial Bible Dictionary, Zondervan, 1971, summarizes who Satan is in this way. He snatches away the word of God sown in the hearts of unsaved, Matthew 13:19. He sows his counterfeit Christians among the sons of the kingdom, Matthew 13:25 and 38 and 39. So far, we've only heard from Jesus, right? So Jesus talks about what Satan does is snatches the word from our heart, sows counterfeit Christians among us, okay? Now, let's keep reading. The rest is from Paul, but it's so interesting. Satan blinds the minds of men to the gospel, 2 Corinthians 4, verse 3-4, and induces them to accept his lie, 2 Thessalonians 2, 9-10. Often he transforms himself into an angel of light by presenting his apostles of falsehood as messengers of truth, 2 Corinthians 11, verses 13-15. So one of the greatest things to do to deflect that you're serving Satan and don't know it is but you're being duped. And what Satan would give you as a message is exactly, look the other way. Look at the other guy. That guy is the bad guy. Not me, not my guy. So that's Paul's own words. What Satan is, he's an angel of light, and that matches what Jesus says elsewhere. Based upon Paul's writings, we find this obvious association did not ever cross Paul's mind. Paul asked the voice on the road to Damascus who it is. The voice said in version 1 in Acts 9 and in version 3 in Acts 26, I am Jesus whom you persecute. Beyond that, Luke gives us no other reason to prove this is Jesus. Should Paul be taking a blinding light's word for anything? Some commentators suggest not. Quote, this is Professor of Theology Dallas McCown, behold, the Antichrist spent them on religion. Quote, apparently all it took to convince Paul that he was hearing the voice of Jesus was for the voice to say so. Published in 2004, page 122. And incidentally, if you want to get to a more accurate version of our Greek New Testament, it always is helpful to look at the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew of Professor Howard, because clearly it shows that there are some translation mistakes. For example, it says in the Greek, it says that John the Baptist ate locusts. Who eats locusts? Well, what it actually says in Hebrew is eats manna. If you translate manna from Hebrew into Greek, the word for locust and manna is one letter difference. The letter A and E is the difference. So somebody misspelled it or it was misread with the letter, I think it's A. Acris is locust, and they read it that way when it was ekris, which is actually manna. And so when you go back and you look at this Hebrew Matthew, you get to see this. We're looking at the underlying text of the Greek New Testament before it was translated into Greek. So please note what it says in the original of verse 5 at Matthew 24, verse 5. For many shall come in my name, saying, I am he, the Messiah, and shall lead you astray. So even the apostles were going to be led astray by this original false Christ. And who else could it be? This is the very first warning he gives. So he says, what are the signs of my coming? And the very first sign he says is false Jesus. People who will falsely claim they're me will lead you astray. Not like it's not like it's impossible that you're so in tune with me you can't be led astray. He's actually going to say it will lead you astray. This claim that this was from Jesus. And I always like to verify things. Here's the face page, Hebrew Gospel Matthew, 1995. Jesus answered them, beware lest anyone should lead you astray, because many will come in my name, saying, I am the Messiah, and they will lead you astray. Very first warning he gave. All right. Now, let me talk to you about who is Paul's Jesus on a more in-depth level. Now, this idea of Paul being seen by someone who is brighter than the sun and a light in the middle of the desert outside Damascus, this is like a sign and wonder, right? It's a miraculous appearance of someone physically on earth who's in heaven, right? But was this a sign of wonder from God? And would the Lord of life actually inflict blindness on someone supposedly miraculously converted moments before, as most commentators insist happened? One must wonder. Jesus said he came to, quote, restore sight to the blind, Luke 4 verses 18 to 19. The true Jesus only restored sight to the blind and never inflicted blindness. See Matthew 9:27 to 28, Matthew 20 to verses 29 to 34, Mark 10 verses 46 to 52, and Luke 18 verses 35 to 43. In the Bible, God never inflicts blindness on regenerate persons, but promises to blind apostates. God, through an angel, inflicts blindness in Genesis 19 on evil lost men to protect Lot from the men trying to enter his house. Genesis 19 verses 4 to 11. God, in Deuteronomy 28, promises to inflict blindness and cause you to grope in midday when one refuses to obey his law. Hence, any infliction, that's apostasy, by the way, an outright refusal to obey God's law is apostasy. Hence, any infliction of blindness, if it truly came from God, would have to only be upon an unregenerate lost soul or an apostate. It would be punishment. Thus, if this sign were from God, Paul should have realized it was a punishment for the evil and apostasy he had done, not because now he was chosen by God. There is no example of God inflicting blindness on a regenerate man in the Bible. Some believe Samson proves otherwise. However, Samson, a man of God, was blinded by the Philistine, not by God. This happened only after Samson's last link to the power of God was broken when Delilah cut his hair, breaking his Nazirite vow to which Samson was subject, not to let his hair be cut. Prior to that time, Samson, an Israelite, was spiritually blinded first that he had gone against a law which is only applicable to Israelites, when he said, quote, a foreign woman was right for my eyes, Judges 14, verse 1. Hence, physical blindness in the Bible can come from evil forces upon a spiritually blind person when God's power is no longer present at all over that person's life. God never inflicts blindness on the regenerate. See Chad Harstock's Sight and Blindness in Luke Acts, Brill, 2008 at 107. So Paul could not have been a regenerate person, as many claim. He had no conversion when he's blinded. Therefore, he's lost. And the blindness didn't come from God unless Paul's already an apostate. That's something that we know only later happens. At this time, he's just simply a murderer and causing people to blaspheme. And he's an evil man. But, if God's trying to save this soul and Jesus is going to save him, why would Paul's Jesus blind him unless Paul's Jesus is not really the true Jesus and is from Satan, and Satan himself? Wasn't the fact that Paul was breathing murders, as Luke depicts him in Acts 9:1, just before his experience, prove Paul was as spiritually blind as you could be? If God inflicted this blindness, this alone would prove Paul was unregenerate and lost. Wasn't Paul self-professed being a blasphemer and a violent man? Those are his words, 1 Timothy 1:13. Just prior to this, render Paul as completely outside the power of God, just as Samson? Didn't this also, therefore, subject Paul to the power of evil to blind him just as Samson became subject? Hence, if one thought God caused this blindness instead, we know God wouldn't ever blind Paul unless Paul was a completely lost soul like the men whom the angels blinded in Genesis 19, verses 4 to 11. So either way, Paul was unregenerate at the moment of this appearance of someone coming in Jesus' name. So why would Jesus come to a lost soul and give him the mission to be anything? He's lost. And we see all the proofs of it later. He's an apostate. He's listening to a Jesus in his head in 2 Corinthians 12:7 that refuses to release Paul from the torment of an angel of Satan. Go look at 2 Corinthians 12:7. Why would this be the true Jesus? But I digress. I don't want to digress too much. Let's keep going. And I want to now just interject an observation made by a pastor. So he's a normative Protestant Christian in that sense. His name is Anthony Buzzard. He's retired now. He's sort of braver, I think, than maybe some people would be. But he basically calls out the Pauline gospel as robbing Jesus of his authority. So put this in conjunction with what we just learned, that who is the alternative, who this could be. It can't be the true Jesus. I just showed you that because standing by Paul in his room, in this locked room, had to be the only being who could have done that is an angel. And what angel could possibly that be if Paul gets blinded? It had to be the blinding angel of light, Lucifer. Okay. Now, to corroborate that, listen to what this Anthony Buzzard says about the effect of Paul in our Bibles. And have we passed the test of God to reject apostates who tell us not to follow God's law? That's in Deuteronomy 13, 1-10. So if we have overlooked that, God says, I'm testing you. I'm going to allow false prophets who teach you against my law to see if you love me with your whole heart, mind, and soul. Please go look at that. Let's read what he says. Billy Graham in the gospel. So Billy Graham got corrupted in his later gospel in the 1970s. The 1950s was okay. 1970s, no, not so good. Billy Graham in the Gospel, Buzzard says, a widely circulated tract entitled What is the Gospel, which contains no reference to the kingdom of God, this is from Billy Graham's association, declares that Jesus, quote, came to do 3 days' work, to die, be buried, and raised, and that he came not primarily to preach the gospel, but he came rather that there might be a gospel to preach. It is difficult to reconcile these statements with Jesus' declaration that he was commissioned for the very purpose of proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom. Luke 4, verses 43. Exclamation mark. Again, Billy Graham says Jesus came to do 3 days' work. But Jesus said, Buzzard says, I came to preach the gospel of the kingdom. That is the reason why I was commissioned. Luke 4:43. It's not an afterthought that Jesus came with the gospel. It's what his whole mission was. And so it wasn't to that a gospel other than his own could be preached. That's totally satanic, is what he's saying, as you'll see as we go. So here's what he says. Now I'm introducing it. Did Satan become a counterfeit Jesus on the road to Damascus? That's me. Pastor Buzzard unwittingly proves our point when he writes. And I mean unwitting in the sense he's not trying to say that Paul's experience on the road to Damascus was false. He's saying how Paul's words have been used to destroy Jesus' gospel in the modern Christian church. Okay, so let's see what he says. It seems to be, to me, clear that Satan could well play on the weakness of the religious spirit of man by presenting a Jesus who was only vaguely and superficially the Jesus of the Bible. The counterfeit could, however, be most subtle. Satanic strategies would work hard to separate Jesus from his own teachings. Dispensationalism comes to my mind, laid out in the clearest form in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Jesus might then be only a religious symbol offered as a spiritual panacea for the world's and individuals' ills. The Jewish apocalyptic Jesus, the preacher of a coming just society on earth, the kingdom of God, might then fall into disrepute and obscurity. My friends and neighbors, listen to me. That when you go to Jesus' Words on Salvation, our book on Jesus' Words on Salvation, every chapter there will seem completely foreign to you because every week you go into church, it's 13 quotes of Paul for every quote of Jesus. I've done this for many years. I kept a tally log of every quote of Jesus. Every time I heard one, I go, great, one for Jesus. Then there were 13 tally marks for Paul. But I digress. So Buzzard continues. Jesus' reappearance in preaching would probably appear strange and unwanted even to churchgoers who have been fed a diet missing the New Testament Hebrew ingredients. That is the sickness of our time. Our Christian churches are following Paul. They're not following Christ. So our mission here is to return people to following Jesus. That's our goal. Jesus' words only. That's the true canon. That's the answer. And we need to all encourage each other to get back to Christ, which is who we claim to follow in the first place. It shouldn't be a controversial proposition. That's all I'm saying. Okay, now I know that was a long digression, but anyone debating on this topic who wants to challenge and claim who this really is and say, oh, well, if it isn't Jesus, who else could it be? I've answered that. So hopefully this doesn't even come up. But if you want to, here's the argument I'm going to present if you bring this issue up. So now let's get back to my review of Johnny's comment and my responses. All right, so now we'll pick up my reading of the letter to Johnny, and we'll restart from where we left off. You claim that myself, and by implication these 7 scholars, the ones who said that Jesus appeared physically to Paul in that room in the citadel, are being presumptuous in not imagining a modern English colloquialism may have been intended 2,000 years ago by Luke writing Acts 23:11. The colloquialism is that we have a song that says, stand by me, and it doesn't mean come physically stand by me. It means come support me. And so that's a colloquial expression, changing the meaning from a literal stood by me to a support me at a distance. However, that does not wash. Interpreting Greek words by someone trained academically in Greek is not presumption, but taking the words in the way the speaker likely intended them. By your standard, all English translations of the Bible since the 1300s are presumption. That does not wash. What such translations can represent is the best good faith readings possible based on all we knew about the Greek words when used in the sentence at the time of English translation. Of course, there are people who translate it with bias. We have all proof and examples of that. But the general rule is people are doing the best they can to translate. They're not allowed to make up stuff by using current modern colloquial expressions and injecting that into the Bible of the past, unless we can prove those same colloquialisms existed in the past. Continuing. Hence, from all we know now, Paul meant indeed Paul's Jesus stood by him, and then Paul's Jesus uttered 16 words in Greek to Paul, very reminiscent of the road to Damascus experience of Paul with Paul's Jesus. I just want to add here is if this were the true Jesus, and even if this was Satan himself, the person involved here would want to come down and be the most clear, which is not a vision, and he would want to appear physically and make it emphatic. And we learn from the book of Numbers, God says when he speaks to Moses, he speaks clear face to face, but he speaks in visions and riddles and dreams, which are less clear and harder to understand. So that's why God or Jesus, if it were truly Jesus, would come in person and to provide this kind of level of encouragement, right? Why would he, if he could appear on the road to Damascus, why couldn't he appear again here? So clearly, again, this supports the argument that this person, whoever it was, physically appeared to Paul. Let's continue. Moreover, the English colloquialism of stand by me as merely moral, meaning moral support without physical presence, cannot in fact be presumptively used on Greek culture at that time, because we have no example of that in Mounsley's lexicon where such evidence would be offered if it were appropriate. Thus, to use a modern day English expression that happens to have the word stand in it, where stand can be done by long distance, and then view that as the meaning in Greek is indeed presumption. That is, forming a conclusion without any evidence to support that meaning existed in Greek. Instead, you have to find whether this colloquial expression, stand by me, was ever used in Greek and had this support at a distance, meaning in the first century. Now, actually, it's stood by him is what Luke says. So it doesn't even say stand by me, but I'm using his own words. I'm just not trying to be too picky here. Uh, so let's study more deeply, though, the words stood by him, which are in Greek here, epistemi autos. What is the meaning of epistemi? I'm just going to pick out a few things here because I want to speed this up. It can mean to come near, approach. That's a physical proximity. And it can be to be at hand. That's a physical proximity. To be present. That's a physical proximity. Now, there are a couple of meanings that are more metaphorical, and that's to be pressing, urgent, or earnest. And that doesn't mean, however, being spiritually with someone in support. Okay. So this idea of support or stood by me, stand by me, is not the meaning that is conveyed in even those words right there. It doesn't have that implication. So, John, in using a lexicon, not presumption that we can rely upon an English colloquialism, stand by me, the song, Paul told Luke that Jesus stood near or stood by himself in that room, and then Jesus uttered 16 words. The other meanings of epistemi, Mounsley's lexicon, emphasizes a physical proximity to Paul, come near, approach, to be at hand, and most clearly to be present. And then I pointed this out verbally before. By contrast, the vision experience with Yahweh is a dream. God, Yahweh says this in Numbers 12, 1 to 14. And unlike how he talks to Moses, which is face to face, thus this means that God is not present in that room with the true prophet who's merely having a vision. So if God wanted to speak to Paul, again, I'll just say it clearly, or Jesus would come down and want to speak to Paul clearly and give him that encouragement. Why wouldn't he have shown up in person? If he did it once before and at the road to Damascus when he was a blasphemer and a murderer and had not repented, why couldn't he at this time show up to him in person and give him direct encouragement if that was the true Jesus? So but we know he can't because it's the Son of Man prophecy. But we don't pick and choose how to read something because we don't like the consequence that Paul would be invalidated. We have to read it the way it reads and not add presuppositions to try to change it into something other than what it really was. Let's continue. Had Luke meant Paul's Jesus stood by Paul emotionally, or words to that effect, the English colloquial meaning, which you imagine could be equally used in Greek, but there's no lexical evidence that proves this so far, what follows does not fit that. Paul gives concrete expression to Paul's Jesus, who stood adjacent to Paul in a private room where then Paul's Jesus utters 16 words as if spoken on the spot to Paul. If the meaning you suggest were true, Paul would have said, Jesus brought me words of encouragement, rather than use the verb stood, which conveys physical proximity and being at hand or present, as the translation above indicated in the lexicon. The 16 words that follow corroborate this. I trust you'll recognize that the reading you make of a colloquial meaning of today in English of gave support as what Paul's Greek meant by stood by himself 2,000 years ago is truly what is presumption and opinion without any factual proof whatsoever. Hence, clearly Paul's Jesus appeared yet a second time on earth, Paul claimed post-ascension. However, the consequence is that Paul's Jesus cannot be the true Jesus. For the true Jesus said he could not return that way. Jesus warned that anyone claiming that he saw himself in an inner room was not to be believed, for this coming of the Son of Man will be seen by every eye, all points east and west. See Matthew 24, verses 26 to 27. Blessings, Doug. Okay, so I think that presents my position in response on this argument that it wasn't really Jesus physically appearing to Paul, because we can use our English American colloquialism from a song, "Stand by Me," as a way of interpreting the Greek meaning here. You can't do that. It just doesn't work. It's not. All right. So I hope that helps everyone. God bless. Take care. Ciao. Bye.